Good morning again, folks. This is Michael Pimentel with the California Transit Association. I want to thank you for joining us this morning for what is a new webinar series that we're hosting in partnership with the California Hydrogen Business Council. It's focused entirely on hydrogen fuel cell technologies and their promise for electric transit. The reason we brought this to you all is that we realize that for many transit agencies in our state, there's been a focus on battery electric technologies, and while we are a technology neutral association, we thought it was important to make sure that folks knew about the advantages and the opportunities that exist with hydrogen fuel cell technologies. We're very happy to be partnering with the California Hydrogen Business Council on this webinar series, and as you'll see, we are trying to provide both technical information as well as experiences from transit agencies who have deployed this specific technology. Now, because we are doing this webinar in partnership with the California Hydrogen Business Council, we do have participants who come from both of our memberships. And so for that reason, I want to give folks just a quick overview of the California Transit Association and who we are. So we're a trade organization representing more than 200 transit-affiliated entities in the state. That includes more than 80 transit agencies, but also includes OEMs, technology providers, consultancies, support groups, and many other groups. And we focus on advocating for policies, regulations, and funding solutions that support and advance public transit. To that end, we were heavily involved in discussions at the California Air Resources Board on the development of the Innovative Clean Transit Rule. Now, in particular, we led negotiations with ARB on behalf of our transit industry to make sure that that regulation was one that could be operationalized in a way that would support transit operations, that wouldn't be unduly burdensome on transit agencies, and most of our efforts focused on the provisions that you see on your screen. Now, I'm not going to give you all an overview of the STT regulation, as I imagine many of you are familiar with it. However, I want to highlight for you that we are moving away from advocacy on the rule itself towards supporting our membership on the implementation of that rule. And we see this as being a three-pronged approach that focuses on advocacy before the state legislature and with bodies like the CEC and the ARB, insofar as we're talking about new funding streams, new tax measures to support our transit agency members in complying with the rule. We also see our role as being one of outreach and education. This webinar, I think, is a good example of that. We're wanting to make sure that our transit agency members are fully apprised of all the funding and technology opportunities that exist for them to ultimately comply with that rule. And then finally, our association will be tracking our members' compliance with the rule so that when and if an issue arises, we're able to raise it to the appropriate state entities so that it can be resolved. Now, at this time, I'm going to just quickly provide you an overview of one of the key things for this webinar. We do anticipate that it will be interactive, and so you do have an opportunity to ask questions. At the far right of your screen, you should see a text box where you can send messages to us. I'm joined here by our communications director, Jeff Wagner, who will be harvesting questions as they come in. And at the very tail end of this webinar, you'll have an opportunity to ask those questions of any of the panelists that have joined us here today. Now, I will note for you all, because we do get this question with every webinar that we host, the PowerPoint presentation will be available to you after this webinar ends. It usually takes a day or two for us to just finalize it and also make the video and audio for this webinar available to you all. We'll be sending that out to our members via our executive director's report and in the notice for our next webinar in this series. And we'll be sharing those materials with CHBC so they can provide them to their members as well. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Emmanuel Wagner from California Hydrogen Business Council, so he can give you a bit of an overview of their association and the work that they do.
All right, thank you so much, and welcome everyone also from the CHBC. I'm Emmanuel Wagner, Deputy Director of the California Hydrogen Business Council. We are very happy to work with CTA on this webinar series, and I will keep my remarks fairly brief. The CHBC, the California Hydrogen Business Council, is the trade association for the hydrogen fuel cell industry in California. And we hope that this webinar series will be educational for you. We also invite you and look forward to your participation in the next 3 webinars later this month. And on the next slide, I'd be happy to talk about who the CHBC is and what we do. We're a member-based association dedicated to commercializing hydrogen and fuel cells in the energy and transportation sector, and that includes freight, transit, and stationary power. The CHBC itself focuses on advocacy action in Sacramento and on the local level, and our advocacy is centered around currently 4 specific initiatives. Those are related to renewable hydrogen, renewable gas integration, station build-out, and education of decision makers. In addition, we provide sector-specific activities for members, specifically around goods movement and freight and ports, energy storage and renewable integration, and most relevant to this group, public transport. Now, on the next slide, you'll see our membership. We have over 100 members that basically represent the entire part of the hydrogen fuel cell supply chain, including manufacturers of fuel cells, electrolyzers, vehicles, but also gas and electrical utilities, station developers, agencies, component suppliers, and of course, public transit systems. On the next slide, you'll see why we're talking about, why we have this webinar series. As Michael alluded to, there are 2 zero-emission bus options available, and there are only 2. Many of you are fairly familiar with battery electric buses, and that's not the focus here. Our whole idea is to talk about fuel cell electric buses. And as Tim will be able to talk to you about, but that's, we call it the other electric bus. I'm going to just cover sort of a high-level discussion here. Fuel cells have very specific, benefits and advantages, as well as disadvantages compared to batteries. And it really depends on your specific needs, on what the best choice for you as a customer or a transit agency, what it is. Most or basically, fuel cell buses can be a one-to-one replacement. Actually, I'm still on the previous slide, sorry. Can be a one-on-one replacement for diesel technology. That means they can meet the performance of a regular conventional bus in operation today. They can meet regular highway speeds, meet heavy-duty requirements, climb up hills. They offer long range, and quite importantly, they can refuel in minutes. As such, they're also very scalable. The requirements for a fueling infrastructure for a dozen buses or 50 buses is not considerably different than for 100 or 150 buses. So it scales up quite well. And I invite you to kind of read up on some of these specifics on the fact sheet that we've made available on our website that we've developed in collaboration with the California Fuel Cell Partnership. Quick update on where we are. Fuel cell buses have been in operation for more than a decade in California. There are currently 21 buses in operation, and at the end of the year, there will be 40. So, it's important to know that this is not a demo technology. These buses have been in operation, and they have been performing well for a while. And, you're very aware of the ICT regulation. So there are certain requirements that you have to meet. 25% of purchases by 2023, 50% of ZEBs by 2026, 100 by 2029, and complete transition to entirely zero-emission transit fleets by 2040. So that's not a lot of time. And we believe that for many of you, fuel cell buses can be a very good option to meet your needs. And you'll hear more from our speakers on the specifics for that. Now, Of course, we're a trade association. We do events. I highly welcome you to participate and attend some of those industry events. It's a great way to learn about the technology and new product developments, and to also get connected and get a better feel for the pulse of the industry. So there's a policy summit in Sacramento that's coming up in August. There's some energy storage workshop in September, October. Importantly for this group, there's a ICT regulation workshop we're going to do in November 2019, and a ports briefing in December 2019. You can read up on those events on our website under CHBC events, and we also feature a lot of events that we're not specifically involved in, but that are also relevant to the hydrogen fuel cell industry and possibly to you as well. So with that, I'll stop here. I would welcome you to reach out to me to follow up with questions or specific activities that we may be engaged in. My contact information is on the slide. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our next speaker. Thank you.
All right, and Emmanuel, thank you so much for that introduction of CHBC. And for folks on the call, we are joined now by Tim Sassine of Ballard Power Systems. Tim is a member of the California Transit Association's Zero-Emission Bus Task Force, as well as CHBC, so we're happy to have him. Tim, I'll hand things over to you.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Tim Sassine. I'm the Business Development Manager for Ballard Power Systems for the California market, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about fuel cell bus technology. Ballard, as many of you know, is the world leader in heavy-duty motive fuel cell technology. And in fact, this year we're celebrating our 40th anniversary, and we've logged over 10 million miles of fuel cell bus experience over the past couple of decades. Today, I'm going to talk to you a bit about fuel cell bus technology, what a fuel cell bus looks like, and how fuel cells operate, and kind of the simplicity of operation of this technology. We'll look a bit at the history of fuel cell buses and some of the deployments that are going out today, both in California, around the US, and globally, and some of the benefits of fuel cell technology for electrifying your bus fleets. Next slide, please. So it's important to remember that a hydrogen fuel cell bus is an electric bus. In fact, we utilize the same electric drivetrain as battery electric buses. Many manufacturers, such as New Flyer and Solaris and Van Hool, use the very same platforms that they use for their battery buses for fuel cell electric buses. The difference is in the generation of that electricity. A fuel cell module can be thought of as an onboard battery charger. So rather than charging up your batteries from a stationary source or from a catenary source, you bring your charger on board, and that charger operates by reacting hydrogen. And if you look towards OEMs globally, you'll see more and more are offering both variations, which suit different purposes. And as Emmanuel mentioned, battery electric buses, very appropriate for some applications. And as you'll see, a lot of the benefits of fuel cell buses address the applications which are best suited outside of battery electric buses. On the next slide, we'll take a look at the configuration of a fuel cell electric bus. And a lot of this will be familiar to those of you who have looked at CNG buses or who have looked at battery electric buses. On the roof, we have containment for the hydrogen storage, and some number of cylinders. We've got a battery, which is hybridized with the fuel cell, which I'll talk about in a minute, also included in the drivetrain. In this case, when we hybridize with batteries, we're using a much smaller amount, so something on the order of 50 to 100 kilowatt hours in today's fuel cell buses. We've got, of course, our air conditioning units and cooling packages for the drivetrain, but back there in the rear of the bus, where you would normally see an engine, that's where the fuel cell goes, and that provides power along with the batteries to the electric motor, and all of that is coordinated by the control system, which different manufacturers have different approaches for, and as we see, as they optimize over the years, get more and more efficiency and provide a lot of benefits that are becoming even greater. And this is all in addition to not only the range improvement that you can see with fuel cell electric buses, but because they do have a gaseous fill, they have very fast refilling advantages, and very high performance across the entire operating cycle of the bus. We'll look at, in the next slide, the internals of a fuel cell and exactly what a fuel cell does. So fundamentally, a fuel cell is going to use hydrogen to generate DC electricity. And on the bottom left, you can see a diagram of what a fuel cell unit cell looks like. On one side, on the left side in this case, we have hydrogen coming in, and it's reacting across a membrane with oxygen. It's reacting without burning. It's oxidizing that hydrogen without burning it. And it's doing so at a lower temperature. So not only does it not create oxides of nitrogen, but it's a fully reversible process, and there's no pollution or external byproducts created. The hydrogen comes in on the left through the bipolar plate. The electron goes into your electrical circuit. The proton reacts across the membrane, or the membrane electrode assembly, or MEA, and it meets up with the oxygen on the other side, creates water, creates heat in the process, and power for your motive system. And that's essentially it. Hydrogen reacting with oxygen, creating water, and creating electrical power and heat. That's a unit cell. And it's made up of, as I said, two plates on either side, conductive plates, which have flow channels for the gases, and a membrane in the middle. That cell will produce something like 1 to 2 volts, depending on its operating conditions. You put together multiple cells, as you do in a battery, to create higher voltage levels. Multiple cells put in series together create a fuel cell stack, shown there in the middle. You put multiple stacks together to create the power level that you want, and you put that stack inside of a box called a fuel cell power module. And inside of that module also is the control monitoring of the fuel cell stack and direction of the gases and recirculation of the hydrogen and the control system. And that's what Ballard produces, is that fuel cell power module. That power module creates the DC power, which the bus integrator will then use in parallel with their batteries to power the fuel cell bus. On the next slide, we'll take a look at the history of Ballard's work on fuel cell buses. So way back in 1993, you may remember that's when Bill Clinton was entering office and Jurassic Park was in the theaters. Jeffrey Ballard was putting his first fuel cell bus into operation at the Expo in Vancouver. That was the phase 1, which led to the phase 2 bus. And soon by 1996, our first fuel cell bus in transit operation was seen in Chicago and also in our hometown of Vancouver, carrying passengers around and providing electric bus transportation in real transit conditions. That was followed by the phase 4 bus, our first bus to go out to Sunline. And the phase 5 followed shortly thereafter as a pure fuel cell bus and was operating in not only 7 different countries and 10 different cities in Europe, but also deployed in Perth, Australia and Beijing, China. Following that was the phase 6, where we hybridized the fleet, and that introduced batteries not only to capture regenerative braking, but also to optimize the efficiency of the fuel cell power unit. 20 of these buses went out to provide transport for the 2010 Olympic Games in Vancouver. And following that, our next rollouts across Europe, really greatly expanding and leading to the Jive and Jive 2 programs, now set to deploy 300 fuel cell buses across Europe, greatly adding to our capabilities to reduce costs on these fuel cell buses. And now we're seeing rapid market adoption, particularly across California, seeing new fleets coming out in both north and south, at AC Transit, at Sunline, as Rudy's going to tell us about, at Orange County. And now, as we see our 130 fuel cell buses around the world, we have an additional 2,400 planned, reaching out globally. And I'll tell you about those in a minute. The next slide shows us the conditions that we've operated in. We've, as I said, we've been on the road for more than 20 years and over 9 miles, hitting 10 million miles in service. The availability of the fuel cell module is exceptional and increasing with time, over 97% availability in these field deployments. Our stacks continue to increase in lifetime. with over 30,000 hours now being seen in buses in operation. And it's not just Ballard stacks as well. AC Transit will tell you that they've got technology from United Technologies where their fuel cells are exceeding 30,000 hours too. Just a testament to the appropriateness of this technology for long range and heavy duty applications. And we've operated in very challenging routes and climates. We've been deployed in Stockholm, Iceland, of course, in sunline in the Palm Desert, from heat to cold, and challenging grades up and down the mountains of Whistler, and really about anywhere you would put a transport bus, a transit bus, you would see a fuel cell bus in operation and enjoying the same kind of operational capabilities as you would for a conventional bus. In the next slide, we talk about the fuel cell buses that are out and available now. So we've got 50 fuel cell buses around California, primarily at the transit agencies listed there, AC Transit, Orange County, and Sunline, a few others such as at UC Irvine. There are 2 fuel cell electric bus manufacturers, which both, for the US, which both have Altoona tested models. New Flyer has a 40-foot and a 60-foot version of their Charge H2 fuel cell electric buses, and El Dorado with their Access fuel cell electric bus in a 40-foot version, and also coming out with a shorter 32.5-foot version as well. In the next slide, some of the benefits of fuel cell electric buses, some of which many of you know. Of course, the range advantage. Now our latest bus deployments are showing in excess of 300 miles for proven range, up to 350 miles for some of these buses. Rapid refueling. It's a gaseous fuel. We can see refueling of a bus in these conditions inside of 10 minutes, inside the time that you would expect to refill a diesel or a CNG bus. And for the same amount of range, less weight. And weight, of course, translates not only to vehicle lifetime, but also to passenger load capabilities. So these things all together give us a one-to-one replacement of conventional vehicles. And from a transit operator's perspective, that's operational flexibility. That means with a fleet of fuel cell electric buses, you can put those buses on the routes that you need to at the times that you need to. So the performance of the bus, as I mentioned, really, we talk about range a lot, and that's a lot of what fuel cell electric buses have to offer, but really it's the tip of the iceberg for what you can gain out of fuel cell electric buses. You also get constant performance throughout the day. So as you use up your fuel, the power output from the fuel cell module doesn't change. It stays the same from full tank to empty tank. Also through weather, as I mentioned, no degradation of the performance output of the fuel cell module or for the range of the bus due to weather conditions, be they heat or cold. And in fact, we can harvest some of the heat that's produced by the fuel cell for enhanced bus heating. So not only do you have more energy on board for your HVAC system, but you can use that heat to offset the power needs for heating up the passenger compartment for colder days. And of course, we are able to maintain those batteries in a more narrow band for a state of charge, not deeply charging or discharging them, and extending the life of the batteries that we do have on board. In the next slide, we look at the maintenance cost of fuel cell electric buses. So now there are some reports from NREL which show that we're achieving comparable maintenance costs as CNG buses, and we expect that to improve greatly in the near future, particularly through advantages of scaling. As our supply chain matures and we're able to develop not only lower cost components, but longer lifetime components, we have a whole new generation of balance of plant components that we're pretty excited to release very soon that will greatly increase the lifetime of key components and reduce the PM needs for those. We're offering comprehensive warranties now, 250,000 miles or 6 calendar years. And we're doing training on site and in Vancouver for maintenance technicians so that the transit operators can perform the very simple maintenance tasks that are required for these buses. In addition to that, providing service teams to help transition transit operations to servicing fuel cell electric buses, and providing a powerful knowledge transfer, doing what we can to really enable transit agencies to have full capability and comfort and confidence with their fuel cell electric buses. But beyond operation, in the next slide, there's a lot of considerations to take into account when you talk about the impact of buses and really the environmental movements and interests for transit agencies as we move into the ICT regulation. We talk a lot about tailpipe emissions, but also we need to consider the end of life and the power plant emissions from the end of life for the prime movers. For fuel cells, we recycle more than 95% of the platinum from a fuel cell when it gets refurbished at its midlife. And in fact, the carbon plates, not only are recyclable, but typically they're reused and they're good for the lifetime of the bus. That is our reconditioning method and our refurbishing method at midlife. So we take those stacks after that 6 years of operation, pull out the membranes, put in new ones, and put it back into operation. So the waste trail behind a fuel cell bus is very minimal. In fact, it's almost negligible, and that's going to become increasingly important as we see higher percentages of fleets going to zero-emission buses and more zero-emission buses on the road. And in the next slide, we'll see that there's a lot of fuel cell buses already, and a lot of fuel cell buses that are being planned. In the U.S., we've got, something like 64 buses that are either in operation or being planned. But Europe is really taking off. They've really embraced hydrogen fuel cell technology. We've got leaders in the UK and in Germany. Cologne alone is going to take another 45 electric buses. And as I mentioned, the JI program seeks to deploy 300 fuel cell electric buses in the near future. And in China, China is expanding greatly, as China often does for renewable technology, looking at achieving 1,000 buses in the very near future. So worldwide deployments accelerating very rapidly, and all of that helps us to also bring down costs to rapidly achieve cost parity in the near future, particularly from the standpoint of California as we look at the ICT regulation, allowing operators to achieve that zero emissions profile in a way that's affordable for all of them. In the next slide, there's a website that we have, very informative and interactive, entertaining. I highly encourage you to check this out. A lot of great information on fuel cells and the fuel cell bus value proposition. And with the next slide, I'll end it there and anxiously await your questions. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Tim, for that overview of hydrogen fuel cell technologies. Folks, before I hand things over to Rudy LaFleur from Sunline Transit, I do want to remind you that you do have the opportunity to ask questions at any point during this webinar. Like I mentioned at the top of the webinar, our communications director, Jeff Wagner, is actively harvesting questions as they come in. We'll reserve them for the tail end of the webinar, but know that you can submit at any time. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Rudy from Sunline. He's going to give you some perspective from a transit agency that is, I believe, a leader in deploying hydrogen fuel cell technology in the country. So, Rudy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to present with such a esteemed panel of experts. Sunline is and will take that title as leader. Thank you. One of the things we want to do, and I believe this is positioned really well, is, what does that mean in terms of the hydrogen industry and the hydrogen technology? And so what Sunline would like to represent to this group is what it looks like in terms of operation. And we're going to make the case for hydrogen technology, I think, in a pretty compelling way. So on the next slide, just a little bit about Sunline, number of routes, number of CNG buses we operate. Sunline was one of the first agencies to convert to completely to CNG. And the number of electric hydrogen buses have grown over time. And one of the most important factors that I would like people to know is Sunline is a transit agency. Sunline has performance metrics that are reviewed every month, and they talk about on-time performance, they talk about fleet availability, but they don't make a distinction between the type of vehicle. There's no distinction between a CNG vehicle and a hydrogen electric vehicle. And that's important to note because, you know, sometimes when we talk about leaders in technology, it sounds like an extraordinary effort, but I think through the leadership of Lauren Skyver at Sunline and the direction of the board, that Sunline has made it a part of their operating norm. It's something that's not a afterthought. It's part of the operational capabilities at Sunline, and we're happy to report that our stats look really great in terms of customer satisfaction, on-time performance, bus availability, and so those things are important to note. On the next slide, we wanted to point out that Sunline has been in the game for a while. As some of the previous speakers pointed out, Sunline was one of the earlier recipients of one of Ballard's first prototypes, actually, delivered in Canada. We have buses from El Dorado, New Flyer, and we have different combinations of systems. You'll note that the newer buses have a smaller fuel cell, which makes it more efficient and reduces the overall cost of maintaining the vehicle. So it's something that Sunline has been a partner in, both with the OEMs and also with the funders. And that's an important point to bring up, that Sunline has been a trusted partner, because as you look at these vehicles, the majority of them have come from discretionary funding. And that's because Sunline has demonstrated to be a competent and committed partner to zero-emission technologies. Next slide. So current fueling, we have a hydraulics reformer. It produces approximately 220 kilograms per day. It uses biogas as a source, which creates credits and revenue for the agency. We use about 100 kilograms per day. There's a public fueling station that generates or is capable of fueling at 350 bar, which is the pressure range. And the average cost is $7 a kilogram for production of hydrogen. Next slide. So the future at Sunline is very bright. Sunline is rolling out a NEL PEM electrolyzer. That electrolyzer will produce 900 kilograms per day of production. So if we look at a vehicle's capability, a vehicle is capable typically of 50 kilograms. So you just have to know that a fully fueled vehicle will hold 50 kilograms. That is not always the operational fueling of a vehicle, but that is the potential of hydrogen, and we'll talk about that a little more later. 60% of that is from renewable solar electricity, which Sunline is investing heavily in, and we'll talk about that in a bit, to reduce overall production costs and increase the renewable nature of its operations. There's approximately 300 kilograms planned for use per day. The new system will have 2 dispensers at a fast fill rate, approximately 20 minutes or less. And then the future holds public fueling. Public fueling will be at 700 bar, which is not only for light duty, but heavy duty vehicle expansion. So Sunline is actively pursuing both the funding and establishing partners to engage in that expansion of its system. Next slide. So Sunline is looking to move into liquid hydrogen as a redundancy component, and that's because the storage capability and energy capability of liquid is greater than that of the gas. And so Sunline is looking at different technological solutions to accomplish that, and partnerships to help that come about. One other thing about Sunline, we saw in an earlier slide about the number of employees. Well, there's not a cadre of people that are focused on keeping these vehicles going. I think there's maybe one person that may have focused on zero-emission technologies, but everyone else is focused on transit in general. And I think that's a point that needs to be highlighted. It's not like this is something that's taxing administratively and organizationally on the agency, and that's why I think it's important to have leadership that recognizes that this is the wave of the future. It's just not a project or something that is temporary. Sunline is looking to contract sources because if you have to go out and pay for hydrogen, that's one of the things that we want to avoid. And we looked at prices that were about $30 a kilogram, which is something that we do not want to experience for any extended period of time. And so that's why the redundancy is there, not only in liquid, but also Sunline will not be immediately decommissioning its existing reformer. So there will be some immediate redundancy in place once the hydrogen electrolyzer is in place. Next slide. So Sunline produces approximately 33% of its electrical energy power from solar, and that is a project that Sunline's in the process of expanding. There's some land that is next door that Sunline is looking at purchasing for solar production. We recognize that getting the price of hydrogen down is really a factor of reducing electrical costs. So Sunline is really actively looking at making that transition. Now there's a second phase under construction. It's currently we're adding solar to one of our employee parking areas. And the goal is to be 100% on solar power for energy needs outside the nighttime fueling. And that will be a tremendous savings for the cost of hydrogen, because the majority of the cost of hydrogen has to do with electrical costs. Sunline has net metering energy agreement, and so that helps save on energy costs, and it's something that we've experienced and something that, quite frankly, Sunline's been sharing with the industry and eager to share through its Center of Excellence that will be rolling out this fall. Next slide. So this shows the solar collector dashboard currently in place from Sunline, and it shows that Sunline is not only interested in new technologies, but we're interested in measuring the effectiveness of those technologies. As I mentioned earlier, there's monthly metric meetings that talk about everything transit. So it's the same metrics that you'd see from a property that is running diesel. And that shows how we have incorporated zero-emission technologies into the day-to-day operations of Sunline. And so this is just a chart that shows our solar collector dashboard, provides us with valuable information about the savings and what's being produced, and it puts it in some context, too, in terms of trees and the effects of the savings on the environment, and as well as on the agency's costs. So there's a double win for that. Next slide. One of the things that Sunline has been proud to be a partner in is the reduction of costs for hydrogen vehicles. We have some approximate dates and amounts that represent the cost of the vehicles. And if I mean, this is pretty impressive if you look at it over time in terms of the reduction of costs. There are also incentives in place that further reduce those costs, especially here in California with the HVIP vouchers. But what we wanted to show with this chart, though, is that the cost of hydrogen is going down in terms of vehicles. The technology is improving, and while the technology is improving, for instance, we saw earlier in a slide where we had different generations of vehicles and different sizes of fuel cells. Well, the earlier fuel cells were more expensive and more expensive to maintain. Well, the industry's gotten better with that by a smaller fuel cell. It's kind of referred to by some people as a range extender, but that reduces the life cycle cost of the vehicle. So while the initial purchase cost has gone down, through efficiencies, the life cycle cost has been reduced on vehicles also. So we wanted to put together this chart to show you that this is the immediate cost, but there are other cost reductions and efficiencies that are at play in the industry that Sunline's taken advantage of. Next slide. And one of the things that agencies are concerned about, and we heard earlier in the presentation, is the maintenance costs. Maintenance cost chart here shows that the fuel cell buses are more than hold their own in terms of reduction in maintenance costs. An electrical motor has less moving parts, and so we're experiencing some efficiencies in terms of overall maintenance of those vehicles. You also see on the chart on the right, it talks about fuel economy, and that's something that we've realized at Sunline is that, it's almost twice the number for hydrogen vehicles as in CNG in terms of fuel efficiency. That is important because that is what really contributes to the overall range potential of a hydrogen vehicle. If you take the chart I showed earlier that talked about 50 kilograms of storage on a bus, and you multiply that times this 5.4 number, which is an average number, it gets over 250,000 miles. 250 miles. So the range is there, and typically, one of the points that was made earlier is that you can't beat the performance and the range on hydrogen vehicles in terms of comparing them to the existing market with other types of electric vehicles. Next slide.
Did we lose you there, Rudy?
My computer shut off because of inactivity. So I'm pulling the slides. Okay, this chart shows infrastructure and scalability, and we thought this was a very impressive chart. This was created by CTE, Center for Transportation and the Environment, and it shows that while you make an initial investment on hydrogen infrastructure, over time that investment pays off, where it's maybe less effort and less cost to get into the battery electric bus arena, but over time the cost is going to increase once you get into double digits in terms of operating battery electric vehicles. So this shows the potential of fuel cell investments in hydrogen technology and fuel cell electric buses, and that's the potential that prompted Sunline to invest in this area, especially given the coverage area of 1,100 square miles out in Coachella Valley. Range was something that was significant and important, and also cost. And so this is I think, a pretty impressive chart that shows the payoff for early investments in hydrogen technology. Next chart. Well, one of the things that, and Sunline's been successful, and so that's why this slide shows that not only having a CEO that's committed to the technology, but having an overall board commitment to the technology is important. As I mentioned earlier, Sunline is heading up commercialization efforts through its formation of the Center of Excellence and also its leadership in establishing a zero-emissions bus resource group made up of industry to make sure that, you know, commercialization drives down the cost and overall the market, it improves the efficiency of the operating equipment. And that's something that Sunline's been heavily invested in, and we're interested in sharing that with people. So Sunline's board created a policy back in '94 dedicated to zero-emission technologies. It developed a mission and a focus on zero-emission bus technology. It gave the CEO latitude to explore these technologies in a very, very objective-oriented way, and that has paid off. And Sunline's successes in the industry, and as I mentioned earlier, Sunline operating public transportation without an asterisk for zero-emission vehicles. Redesigning your existing system. Riders are very excited about zero-emission technologies. Riders are interested in knowing what you are doing in terms of overall corporate citizenship, and I think that's something that people do not give enough credit to in terms of the astuteness of the riders or customers of their transit agency. And one of the most significant things that Sunline has established, not only with manufacturers and operators, but it established relationships with the funders. Sunline, as I mentioned earlier, the litany of vehicles that was cited earlier was based on discretionary funding for the most part. Sunline has proven itself to be a good partner and to have invested in the capability to execute on these projects. And that's something that's paying off big time, and it's a good model for other agencies. Next slide. So Sunline has made a deep commitment in reducing environmental impacts while delivering world-class transit service. Sunline, like many other agencies, are going through redesign to make sure that their routes and their system is what's needed in the community. But there's never an asterisk to say, oh, what about those zero-emission buses? It's just part of the operating norm at Sunline. There's a strong mission and focus on developing and delivering from all levels of the organization. Sunline does not use any solid fuel to deliver its systems. And we're evident, if you looked at Sunline's performance stats, there's objective evidence that the zero-emission technology works. It works in a transit setting. It works with the satisfaction of Sunline's customers, and it works with overall satisfaction of the Sunline Board of Directors in terms of the direction the agency's going. So one of the things that we would implore you is don't wait until the funding opportunity sunset to create a mission and focus and an overall plan. As I mentioned earlier, Sunline is looking forward to investing in its solar energy capabilities to reduce the overall cost of hydrogen. Those systems work together to the benefit of the customers, and we're focused on a holistic approach rather than looking at investments in the technology as some project or something else that Sunline does. Next slide. With that, I will turn it over to the moderator, and thank you for your time.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rudy, for joining us today. And gentlemen, thank you for participating. At this time, I do want to remind folks that we have an ability to ask questions here. We've got quite a few in already. We've got about 40 minutes allotted for Q&A. So we'll see if we ultimately take up that much time. Before we turn over to questions, though, I do want to remind you that this is the first webinar in a 4-part series. On your screen, you'll see the 3 other webinars that we've got planned. The third, the hydrogen infrastructure, scalability and technical considerations webinar, still has a date that's to be determined, but that should be finalized shortly and will be out to you. The e-blast that went out by CHBC has registration links for these webinars, and here at the California Transit Association, we'll be doing e-blasts out to our members the week prior to each of these webinars that will feature both the registration links for the upcoming week's webinar, but then also copies of the PowerPoint and audio and video for the week prior's webinar. So at this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the questions that have come in. And gentlemen, unless someone specifically indicates a preferred respondent, you can take it that these questions are open to the entire group, and I would just ask you to jump in as appropriate. Now, the first question comes to us from David Gincher at Caterpillar, and I'm going to note that his question may be one that's best answered by me, but I would appreciate any additional comments that you all have. And David asks, could you walk us through the Altoona testing? So, David, just to give you some background on Altoona testing, it is a precondition for transit buses to be purchased with federal funds. Something that went into place in the early 90s, and it requires that that a bus actually pass Altoona testing, so those agencies can go ahead and purchase those buses. And it looks at a number of things. It looks at the reliability, the safety, the performance, structural integrity and durability, as well as fuel economy of the bus, and noise and emissions. Now, there are some specific things that they do look at, like brake performance, and say not so recently, they did expand it to include alternative fuel systems like hydrogen, like compressed natural gas and battery electric technologies. And with that, gentlemen, if there's any additional context you want to provide, please do feel free to jump in.
Yeah, this is Tim from Ballard. The Altoona testing is quite rigorous for an accelerated lifetime test. It's a good benchmark for survivability of the system. It also does provide at least some baseline fuel economy tests. There's quite a bit of discussion about how comparable Altoona fuel economy tests are to real life experiences. But I would encourage you, if you're looking at Altoona test reports, it's a good comparative measure. If you look at 2 different buses and they have the same routes that they're tested against for fuel economy, that makes a good comparative measure. And of course, your results may vary depending on your route's elevations and other conditions.
All right, thank you, Tim. Now, the next question comes from Peter Kapik from ZF, and he has a question about hydrogen fuel supply, and he's wondering how distribution works, and asks, can you get multiple suppliers to bid?
So I can start on that, and then Rudy, you can probably add some flavor from what Sunline does. There are multiple suppliers in the market now for supplying hydrogen to have it delivered. Delivered in a liquid form is pretty popular, but there's companies like Air Products, Messer, and Linde also, and Air Liquide, Trillium, just to name a few. There are a lot of options in addition to production on site. So supply chain stability for hydrogen is quite good. Rudy, I don't know if you can comment on Sunline's approach to supply stability.
Well, yeah, Sunline has its own production capability, but when there is a need for hydrogen, there is competition, or having a standby or a contingency in place makes a lot of sense. But in operating the transit system, Sunline is producing its own hydrogen from its utility. So we have talked about, in one of my charts, I actually mentioned the concept of redundancy from liquid hydrogen. And so that would definitely be something that Sunline would be looking to compete and looking for partners for.
All right. So, Tim, this question is directed at you. You did show a slide early in your presentation showing a number of deployments and orders for fuel cell electric buses. A question from David Ginter of Caterpillar is, of the projected deployments, how many are actually firm orders? Do you have a sense of that number?
Well, what we show are from firm orders, yeah. So that's what we're talking about. There actually are more discussions in place than what we've shown on this slide. But yeah, those discussions are evolving. So particularly when you get out to some of the Asian countries, there is some variability there as we have increasing supplies. China, in fact, that number continues to increase. So any variability there is just because those numbers are evolving, but they are based on firm orders.
All right. So next question comes from Dennis Walters at Stars Technology Corporation. Dennis asks, does the production cost of hydrogen include the compression, storage, and dispensing costs, or is this just the direct cost to produce a kilogram?
Sunline tracks all of the production-related costs, including the fuel cost. So it's a all-encompassing cost to that department of producing the fuel, from cost of the raw raw CNG to production, and including the maintenance staff that's associated with that cost. So that's a full-up cost of producing the hydrogen to Sunline that's being represented.
Yeah, and I could say also that AC Transit's published some of their costs for hydrogen, and they're getting costs of about $7.40 a kilogram dispensed. So that's all in considering transport and dispensing and all of the compression, storage, and dispensing costs at the site. In addition, there's been a lot of work on what the trajectory for hydrogen costs will be, and the future webinars will get into that. But I can say, Shell, for one, has publicized for the light duty side that they anticipate achieving $5 per kilogram for fuel contracts on the order of 10 tons per day. That's about 330 fuel cell buses, and $3 a kilogram for 50 tons per day. So that $5 per kilogram for 330 buses, I mean, once you start talking about aggregating fuel contracts among multiple transit agencies, or even some of the larger transit agencies, those lower costs at site, those are costs that go to the retail sites, can be readily achieved just through scale.
All right, next question is directed at Rudy. It's from Kim Okafor from Trillium. And Kim asks, how's Sunline planning on getting the station designed and built? How are they establishing partners? And Rudy, I think this is for the expansion plans that you all have.
Well, so for the current electrolyzers under construction now, we've established a partner through our grant for that. And with the expansion to light duty and commercial, there's different grant and funders that require different processes. Like recently, we were considering, and I believe we put in an application for a grant where the funder required at least 3 quotes. So Sunline is looking to make sure that we adhere to whatever competition requirements are, but make sure we have the strongest partnership available as we engage if it's a discretionary grant. If it's not a discretionary grant, then Sunline typically follows its own procurement policies that require full and open competition at some dollar value. So that's how we do it.
Right, thank you, Rudy. Next question comes from Connor Smith at Trillium, and he asks, how will the new statewide mandatory TOU rate structures affect your rates and ability to move to an expanded dependent on solar? And I believe that should be directed at Rudy.
So Sunline is what's classified under the new regulations as an early adopter in terms of compliance. But as I pointed out, solar is a big part of the overall energy solution for Sunline. And so with respect to the regulations, we're talking solar for infrastructure. The regulation focuses on the vehicle side, but our discussion today was not only about the vehicles that we've invested in, but also our strategy and approach for securing the infrastructure and the costs that are needed to be sustainable. And so the new ICT regulation talks about vehicles, the number of vehicles, and I think it was mentioned earlier, but we're talking about our Sunline's infrastructure strategy and the decisions that we made in terms of solar, renewable biogas, and other decisions that have been made over a period of time.
Thank you, Rudy. Now, one more question for you comes from Dennis Walters at Stars Technology Corporation. He asks, does Sunline have a projected cost per kilowatt hour for the 100% solar powered hydrogen?
Projected cost per kilowatt hour. That is something that I don't have. It's something that we can get to the moderator, but that's something I don't have on me.
All right. Well, thank you. So next question comes to us from James Beck at Gold Coast Transit District. And he says, or he asks rather, could we expect the battery on a hydrogen fuel cell bus to last for the full life of that bus, that being 12 years plus?
Potentially so. So it depends on the lifetime that we're going to see for these batteries. A lot of these battery technologies are getting onto the road in the last 5 or 6 years. But as I mentioned, the way that the system is hybridized, that battery is kept in a narrow charge range as opposed to being completely charged and completely dissipated every day. So as you see, pretty significant warranties coming out from the batteries for battery electric buses. That applies to the battery that goes on the fuel cell electric bus, and I would say even more so. So I think that's reasonable to expect.
So Tim, a question for you, and this is actually one that we were discussing internally, might make some sense for you to respond to, is are there any rare materials or other precious metals that go into the development of a fuel cell that, as we look at the supply chain, we might say there are some risks associated with an expansion of fuel cell technologies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our primary precious metal is platinum, and platinum has been in the supply chain for quite a long time. You might know that it's a primary component or a catalyst for catalytic converters in cars. And because it is so precious, it's worthwhile to recycle. We don't use any cobalt, we don't use any lithium, so exposure to supply chain for those metals doesn't exist for fuel cells. And then for the plates, as I say, we're using carbon, which is definitely a plentiful material. Aside from that, the membranes are a polymer. And as long as we don't burn up all of our fossil fuels, we'll have polymers for quite some time to come.
All right. Thank you, Tim. Now, last question comes to us from James Beck at Gold Coast Transit District, and it's directed at Rudy at Sunline. And he asks, how much revenue does Sunline expect to make on selling hydrogen to the public? And he notes a local context for him, and that's that in Ventura, they don't have a local sales tax measure in place. So the idea of having a revenue source could be something that is attractive to the decision makers at Gold Coast Transit District.
Well, that's a good question, and one that we were discussing at Sunline with our latest grant application. The public station public offering will have both 350 bar and 700 bar capability. Right now, we do not have a committed fleet, but we understand that that is the future technology, and we know that there is a passenger fleet available to light duty fleet to support that. But right now, there is no firm commitment number of a fleet that we can give you firm numbers. We can give you projections, and that's what we would use in our grant applications. But now, we're getting, I believe, with the 700 bar, we're getting ahead of where, or anticipating where the industry is going, so that we could be a part of that. And I believe that there are projections we could provide, but there's no commitment that support those projections.
All right. Well, thank you, Rudy. And at this point in time, we have no more questions in the queue. On your screen now, you have my contact information. I'm Michael Pimentel with the California Transit Association. For the members of my association, you should know that I'm your point of contact on all issues related to zero-emission bus deployment and the innovative clean transit regulation. I'm your liaison to the zero-emission bus task force that we have here in-house, but I also serve as the liaison to the various regulatory bodies that will oversee implementation of the rule. For folks that are not part of the California Transit Association, if you are interested in joining our association, you can feel free to send me an email, and I'd be more than happy to connect you with our member services team. At this time, I think we're ready to close the webinar. I do want to remind you to register for the subsequent webinars in this webinar series, and we look forward to hosting you all again. And to the panelists, thank you so much for joining. Thanks so much, and look forward to engaging with you all soon. Bye.